Welcome to The Learning Landscape, a podcast dedicated to bringing fresh ideas and hope to educators across Tasmania. I'm your host, Simon Matthews, and together with Independent Schools Tasmania, we aim to equip you for success in your education journey. Well, I'm absolutely thrilled to be joined today by Dale Murray, who's the Executive Director of Life Without Barriers Education. Dale, welcome to The Learning Landscape.
Thanks very much, Simon. Nice to be here.
Dale, now I've been told that you're the guy who wants to do schooling differently. From your perspective, why is this not just desirable, but actually necessary right now in the educational landscape of Australia?
Well, schooling differently, that's a big call. I guess where I sit in the education landscape of Australia for the last 35, 40 years of my life, I've been working with creating education environments for young people that, for a range of complex reasons, are outside mainstream education. So not engaging in state education or other systemic opportunities. Usually very much in the main young people in probably very low socioeconomic backgrounds, young people homelessness, caught in pockets of poverty. And young people with complex developmental needs that just haven't been able to maintain engagement with education. So, as I said, I've been doing that for a very long time now, and out of that, I guess we've had opportunities to think about how we think about embedding trauma-informed practice, how we think about embedding child voice, young person voice, into how we're going to be together in schools. And that's, in essence, thinking about how we shift the power relationships between young people and adults in education settings. So that's kind of the very high level kind of thinking about what we've been trying to create.
Look, it sounds fascinating. It's really interesting and really needed. We know that. Tell us a bit of a story, make it a short one, but tell us a story of how you landed in there. I'm keen to know how you landed in this space.
Oh, well, many, many years ago, 1988, I went for a job interview in Woodridge in Logan City in Queensland with a group of young people and the Christian Brothers, actually, Edmund Rice Education Australia, who had started working with young people that were not going to school. It was more of a kind of a drop-in youth centre, but they were focusing on education, and I went for a teaching job there. I met a group of young people there that hadn't been in school for a long period of time, and after trying to engage with them, they weren't interested in engaging with me at all, really, but they took me on a bit of a journey into their life, and we ended up in an old burnt-out rooster and ribs, like a Kentucky Fried Chicken, and 5 out of the 8 kids I was with that day were living in that place. That's where they were living, in the back end of this burnt-out building. And it was right at that point I went, oh, this is very different. But at the same time, these young people were really asking me to think about doing school differently. They wanted to learn, they wanted to do it in a different way, but these kids didn't have access to school uniforms or washing machines or those sorts of things. So you could see why they were really resistant to going into schools, and some of them were also going into schools and creating a bit of havoc. So so anyway, that's where it started for me, really, was with that group of young people telling their story to me and me listening to that, and then going back to the place where we'd started that little journey that day, and me going to the principal of the place saying, I'm really interested in the job interview now, I get it, kind of thing. And he said, well, we'll start tomorrow, hey? So I did that, and years later we've managed to create something like 24 or 25 special assistance schools or flexi schools across Australia now, yeah.
That's staggering. I mean, when you think 25 new schools educating hundreds of students who haven't had that opportunity, that's a phenomenal legacy of yours, Dale. Now, you see lots of these types of schools, flexi schools in action. What are some of the common things that you see in those schools that actually make them so successful? What's so important in those schools that makes them successful?
Yeah, there's a few things. The fundamental piece would be kind of what I indicated at the start, that there's a trauma-informed approach, so that the adults that are working in the place have a really good understanding of what's going on from a neurobiological perspective with young people in relationship to complex development trauma and what's actually happening in terms of escalation. And they have the adults in the places are trained to kind of maintain regulation themselves and not to escalate. I think the other thing that's absolutely essential is the kind of the atmosphere of the school. So I would often talk to young people when I was the principal of one of these places, or when we set these up now, is about, like, we don't have a big long list of school rules. Yeah, what we do have is a sense of common ground that we create. The boundaries of our common ground together around usually 4 or 5 principles, and the words that are often used are respect, relationships, participation, to be safe, and safe in the sense of psychologically, spiritually, physically, big words like safety. And then we would work with groups of young people and adults. So adults sign into these as well. And we negotiate what safety is going to look like. We negotiate what respect's going to look like. We negotiate what having a go or participating is what that's going to actually look and feel like, what we want to see in the place. And I've seen beautiful work on this where there's big posters made up and put all around the school. And that's the sort of starting point for how we're going to be together. The trick with all of that is when someone steps outside the boundary of that, then we've got to sort of stop and regroup and go, well, that's not actually working anymore. So how are we going to fix it? So a lot of this work is about collaborative problem solving, and many of your listeners will know about the work Ross Green does in that sort of space. So that idea of how we fix problems and we problem solve, and then working towards giving young people skills to problem solve and to begin to internalise responsibility for their own behaviour. That's kind of in my mind, what we're really trying to do with these places. The learning piece and the academic piece, in all of the years I've done this, I've never met a young person that didn't want to be engaged in some form of learning, but that getting the conditions for the learning right was the most important piece. Yeah. I can add one more thing. Sorry to interrupt you. The other thing is the physical space. Yeah. So I've been involved in building schools and that kind of stuff, and trying to think about the spaces as not feeling so much as a institutional kind of space, but as for example, when I meet with architects these days and we talk about building something, I start now by saying I want to build something that's got a sense of home. Yeah, a sense of home. So the spaces are kind of conducive to a different kind of relationship. It's not trying to, again, as I mentioned earlier, equalise the playing field, reposition the power relationships. Now, often what I find is young people get that really quickly. They get it quickly. It's actually, as a teacher, it took me a while to get there, and as adults, it's a bit hard to get there quick, And I've had some people that I can remember taking teachers for job interviews and walking around the place and getting back to the front of the gate, and they're going, "Yeah, mate, not in a million years. I'm not doing that." But others going, "Fantastic, I love this idea," and buying into it. So I think that's really important. And the final comment I would say is food. Make sure we've got adequate food for everybody and people are fed. Yeah. Yeah.
Fascinating. Yeah, that's great, Dale. Nice segue, because you say you've done this for a while as a leader. What are your reflections on what the mindset and the capabilities that you have brought, and let's broaden that out, what do other leaders need to lead successfully in these sort of more flexible and inclusive spaces? What does that look like for a leader? What do they need? What's in their toolkit?
In the toolkit's interesting. From a leadership point of view, it's pretty much all the same things any other leaders would have in these spaces. Being very relational, not to jump to kind of quick conclusions about things. To be distributive, to try and devolve issues to a place where everyone has an opportunity to collaboratively problem solve, to maintain listening and try not to move to quick decisions on things too fast, to buy time for yourself. Like all leaders do this sort of thing, sort of go, actually, that's really interesting. I just need a bit more. Can I have a bit more time to kind of think about how we might work through this complexity? I think really a really strong sense of self-regulation. To kind of not go into things heightened is really important. But like all leaders, they need to understand policy. They need to understand, what the mechanisms of compliance are, and school improvement plans and budgets and all that stuff. But in terms of ensuring that the distribution of the leadership and the power of that leadership is spread. I think it's absolutely essential that everyone in the space has opportunity to feeling that they own as much of the space as any leader owns. So I would always talk to young people and staff of, this is our school, this is our community, this is we create the atmosphere together, yeah, and that's how we're going to come together and be together, and to ensure that it's not that sort of heroic leader out the front sort of doing that stuff. I think it's really essential for that. And I think one of the things that's been really interesting for me over the years is a lot of that kind of thinking about education in that way is actually in many ways where some of the bigger mainstream schools that are doing really well are moving towards. They're thinking about school as a one-stop shop of community. They're thinking about these places that are essential in communities for everyone to feel really welcomed and have voice in. Yeah, and I think they're the sorts of places where the flexi kind of schools are actually shining a bit of a light on what the future could look like for mainstream versions of education. There's a few articles written on this, I know, back in the sort of late 90s. Alden Laren wrote one about, how these kinds of education environments are potentially sort of shining lights on what the mainstream could look like. I mean, they're different because they don't have the numbers of kids, obviously, sure, but there's practice in these places that I think is very, very valuable to think about.
Let's kick that down the road a bit. Let's think about education within that broader societal ecosystem. So from your perspective, how can schools get better? And let's think particularly in your sector, this sort of flexible school model. How can we go better with, health and housing and community services to support young people really holistically? And I suppose what we're really saying in that, to support families, to support communities more holistically. What are you seeing? What do you think could work? Or does work?
I think one of the things to think about is if you think about all those schools across the country, and there are all these amazing facilities, and we kind of use them in a kind of very kind of limited capacity. Yeah. So I wonder why we're not opening up schools to have the one door kind of idea. So you come into the community space that is a school, but within that community space, there is opportunities for health services, for dental services, for youth services, like a whole range of kind of community-based opportunities. Some schools are doing this already, but not every school. And I just you do the same thing. You drive around and look at our schools and, at 4:30 or something, they're pretty well shut down. There's still people working and doing stuff, but they're not sort of spaces where communities can come and find other sorts of services. And I visited a number of places on a Churchill I did many years ago, one in New York City called The Door, which is down the southern end of the city. Amazing. You go through one door and in there, you name it, it was there, LGBTQI services, homeless services, health services, dental services, education services, clothing services. There was a cafe in there. All of that was kind of built into the space. Now, I know that there's complexities in relationship to how you sort of fund all those things in a school environment. But, we've just been involved in a piece of work recently, an NH and MRC research called Grand Schools, which is really looking at intergenerational living and learning environments. So thinking about schools and elder Australians finding spaces on school campuses to come together. And in some cases, there's actual residential facilities for older Australians. But thinking about bridging that generational gap by deliberately bringing people together in an education environment. Fascinating piece of research. It's just winding up now, but there's 6 PhDs came out of that piece of work. It's amazing.
It is fascinating. I love it, and I'd love to follow that up with you at some point. Now, the reality is, Dale, that the vast majority of schools in Australia actually aren't flexi or special assistance. So what are the lessons that we can be taking that really we can meaningfully and sensibly and seriously embed in mainstream schools that don't lose the intent of what they look like in a flexi school. From your perspective, what are the things that you say, you know what, you could try that and you could also try that? So what are some of those?
Well, this is the one that often, when I'm sitting with principals from more mainstream environments, I often lose them about now, I'd say. I'll get raised eyebrows and, yeah, mate, whatever. One of the things I think we should really think about is the idea of suspension and exclusion. And I would strongly advocate that we shouldn't have it. Our task as adults, who have got access to more power than young people, is to ensure that if there is issue, we need to wrap more support around, not push away. So I just go, and I think from a couple of perspectives, if we have social policy that says education is compulsory, which we do, and then we have, and I get this complexity, I understand why we have kids that can't be with us, but I think what I see too much of is the end result of many suspensions, which is young people just feeling that they've been ejected from a system. Yeah. If you didn't have suspension and exclusion, but you had other ways of dealing with complex behaviour, and I come from the point of view that all behaviour is communication. So if someone's acting out, you know, they're probably telling you something, but they're also really trying to tell you something that's not working for them. They're scared, or they're angry, or they're escalated. They're telling us something. Our job is to try and help us to understand what they're trying to tell us. What are the conditions that are creating that escalation, and how can we help you overcome those conditions? And what I see far too much of is that, and I'm not having to go at schools here because they're complex places and you've got to make sure everyone's safe and all the rest of it, but more resourcing so we don't ever have to suspend anyone from a school. What we do is say, you're really seeking help from us. We're going to wrap more support around you. That'd be my fundamental.
Yeah, no, that's great. That's great. Yeah, look, thanks. I can see why you've got this reputation of, you know, pushing boundaries, actually making people think and moving them into some complex but necessary space. So, you know, we appreciate that. Dale, as we wrap up, if you looked ahead 10 years, take us to 2036, what would be a big hope that you'd have for education in Australia 10 years down the track? What's in your heart?
That every young person who has, a fundamental right to access their education opportunity in this country is doing it. Because we know at the moment there are thousands and thousands of young people that are not able to access that. And that, I think that whilst we continue to have, large numbers, and, there's a report done by Melbourne Uni when Jim Watterson was there a few years ago now, they've kind of identified 50-odd thousand kids that aren't of high school age that aren't at school. Yeah. That number doesn't exist, that every young person can fulfil their educational potential, and that we build the structures within the systems to ensure that happens. And I'd put also a bit of a add to that young people that are in statutory care or out-of-home care or resi care, that the conditions for those young people, as more support is wrapped around those, because far often the outcomes for that group of young people are educational outcomes aren't great. Yeah, so I do a lot of work in that space as well. But by 2036, you reckon, everyone has access to the educational pathway that they need, and that fulfills their opportunity and potential.
That's a great hope. It's a great goal, and we really thank you that you're working with all your effort toward it, and we want to join you in that, Dale. So thank you. Thanks for joining us today.
No, thanks very much, Simon, and thanks to the systems in Tasmania and to your members for listening. And I'm happy to have you on with everyone. But really great opportunity, and really appreciate it. Thank you.
Great. Well, that takes us in beautifully into the question of, if people do want to continue the conversation, what's the best way for them to do that, Dale?
That's a good question. Send me an email. So it's you can put it up on the thing at the end of this if you like. Or...
Sure. Yeah, no, look, email will be great, and I know that there'll be people who'll be, keen to connect and
on
stay
LinkedIn
connected
as well. They can catch me on LinkedIn, and they can, hook up. They can send something on LinkedIn to me if they like. Be fine.
Great.
Yeah.
Dale, thanks. We really appreciate it. And thank you for tuning in and listening to this episode of The Learning Landscape. We hope that you found some new insights and ideas and even inspiration to apply in your own educational landscape. If you've enjoyed today's discussion, well, please hit like and leave a review. It really helps other educators to find this podcast. And don't forget to share this with any of your friends and colleagues who you think may find it interesting. So until next time, keep exploring the landscape of learning.